Good evening, everyone. My name is Ty Zinkwich. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Instruction here in Spencerport, and I'm joined tonight by our Director of Curriculum, Kristen Fellini. We're really excited that you've taken some time out of your busy schedules to learn a little bit more about assessments, and we hope that tonight's presentation meets those needs. As you can see, we're recording this presentation and it will also be available later on our website. So if we look now at our agenda, going now to the next page here, our objective in terms of this evening is to provide insight on the types of curriculum, the types of assessment that we utilize in our schools, and the various ways that teachers use them to support your children. We will discuss the concept of standards-based grading and provide an overview on the different assessment platforms that we use here in Spencerport. At the conclusion of this presentation, we'll provide a quick overview of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and from a district's accountability standpoint, the importance of participating in state assessments. We'll provide participants an opportunity to pose any question that you have throughout this presentation. You can put it right on our chat, and we'll answer them at the end of tonight's presentation. Please know that both Kristen and myself are available at any point should you have any question that you'd like to pose at a later time. So with the concept of assessment, we thought it would be helpful just to start with the definition of grading. We believe that our parents are familiar with the concept of grades and how we use them to evaluate student learning. Most of us are accustomed to the idea of letter grades, and it can associate the difference between an A and an F. Spencerport follows two different grading systems, and will provide an additional insight during this presentation on those systems. Grading is usually associated with traditional activities such as quizzes, reports, tests, writing assignments, and labs. In addition, some educators may include subjective opportunities for students through participation, effort, attendance, and behavior. I think the difference, though, in why we're here tonight is really our focus on the presentation on assessments. This goes beyond grades and is used to bridge a learning gap or strengthen an area where a child is already proficient. In Spencerport, we attempt to personalize this approach and design instruction to support the individual needs of our students. Assessment should inform instruction. I want to say that again, our assessment practices should inform instruction, and this is where concepts such as differentiation and RTI come into play. Here you could just see at the bottom, I threw a few different items, just to provide you an analogy. I serve as a hockey coach, and when I'm coaching hockey, we work on different concepts of the game during practices. And so that we do that so that when we play in competition, our team experiences success. Some examples could include face-offs in the defensive zone, power play, forechecking, etc. And that assessment during games or during practices, I identify the support that I need to provide to my players. You could make a similar analogy to teaching someone how to learn how to drive a car. All right, driving 10 miles down the road is one piece, versus learning how to parallel park requires different skills and causes students or learners how to drive a car different experiences. And so I think when we think of assessment, it comes in different forms, and Ms. Fellini is going to provide an overview of those forms.
There are many different types of assessments that our teachers use in grades pre-K through 12. They range from state assessments and regents exams down to something as simple as a conversation that a teacher may have with a student. Over the next few slides, we're going to break down the types of assessments and why teachers use this wide variety of assessments to meet students where they are. This table captures the main reasons why we use assessment. We use assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning. Teachers skillfully choose the function of the assessment depending on the lesson's objective, the activity they've planned, or their need to measure achievement. The best way for me to think of this is also through a sports analogy. So if I think of assessment of learning, that's the baseball game. We keep statistics, there's a score, there's a winner, it's high stakes. When we think of assessment for learning, that's baseball practice. That's where we focus on those specific skills, give students feedback, allow them to try and try again in order to be ready for those high stakes games. And then we think of assessment as learning as that mid-season meeting that a player might have with a coach, where they reflect on their performance, they set goals, and they look at areas where they'd like to improve. We often talk about assessments in two different terms. Summative assessment. So when we're talking about that assessment of learning, we're looking to measure student achievement. This is probably the type of assessment we think of most often when we hear the word assessment. Assessment of learning occurs at the end of the learning. So it's the end of the unit, the end of a marking period, or the end of a course. And although there can be many different formats, ultimately summative assessments measure achievement, how well students are doing in progress towards a standard or a learning target. Depending on when the assessment takes place during the school year, teachers can use the information from summative assessments to address any misconceptions noted on the assessment or to adjust instruction moving forward. When we think of assessment for learning, that's what we often call formative assessment. This is a form of assessment that teachers use much more frequently. Some of these assessments are so small that students might not even realize their assessments. So for instance, it might be a quick check for understanding during a lesson, or it might be an exit ticket students complete at the end of a lesson. Teachers use these formative assessments during learning to monitor students' understanding or their ability to apply the knowledge they've learned. The purpose of these smaller assessments is to inform instruction. Which students might need additional assistance? Who might be ready for a challenge? Is there any large-scale misunderstanding that I can address in the next lesson? While we've listed some more traditional forms of formative assessment on this slide, our teachers are also using a variety of engaging technologies. So if you've heard your students talk about quizzes or Kahoot at home, a lot of times our teachers are using gamified experiences for students to engage in assessment. It provides immediate feedback with correct answers. And then teachers are able to use those activities to inform their instruction for individual students, groups of students, or students as a whole. So ultimately, when we take a look at formative and summative assessment, there's definitely overlap between the two. Both are used to provide teachers with information that allows them to best meet students' academic needs. Another analogy that we'll often use with students when talking about the difference between the two types of assessment is that I cook in my family, I cook for a large audience. And so before I put anything on the table, I'm going to taste it. So when I taste the soup, that's a form of formative assessment. I can make a determination if I need an improvement or if it needs an enhancement. But then when I serve that soup and the guests, or in my case, my children, taste that soup, that's really the summative experience. That's when I'm going to get an evaluation as to how well I did in making that particular meal. Assessment as learning is an opportunity for students to gain insight into themselves as learners. It helps them monitor their own progress. It helps them set goals and understand how they learn best. Teachers are often engaging students in this type of self-assessment in a variety of different ways. So they might use learning target trackers, they might use reflection experiences, or KWLs, which is chronicling what do I already know, what do I want to know, what have I learned. So all of these different types of experiences that teachers give to students allow them to reflect on their own learning and to set some goals for future learning.
So as we previously mentioned, we use data from assessments to determine the support that a student may require. We collect this data throughout the school year and use it to revise our curriculum and strengthen our instructional practices. We have a series of half-day release days that you know about that we schedule each year to participate in this work. So for example, most years we have 4 times a year. This year we elected to go with only 3. The first one was right before the long weekend in January. The next one will be scheduled for March 25th, and then the last one falls in June. So we use this time though to engage in this work of reviewing data and helping us with these instructional practices. 3 times a school year, students participate in a series of diagnostic assessments of reading and math, and teachers work with their colleagues to analyze this information. There are times throughout the school year when we'll hire substitute teachers to cover teachers' classes so that they can get together and discuss students that require additional support. These are called RTI days. We have teams discuss and create intervention plans for individual students. These tier 2 and 3 students may work directly with a reading or math intervention specialist or with a teaching assistant in the respective classroom. Every 6 to 8 weeks, these students will complete a quick assessment that serves to monitor their progress, and it lets the teachers know if their intervention is working or if it needs to be modified in some capacity. This work is cyclical in nature, and we use this system to enhance our teaching practices and, most importantly, the learning experiences that our students enjoy. In terms of standards-based grading, that's a concept that might be foreign to some individuals. I'll start first with our curriculum. As you know, it's aligned to the New York State Learning Standards in all of our subjects and disciplines. We review and revise our curriculum continuously, and Mrs. Pelini and myself work with teachers and administrators on identifying need based on changes at the state level. The majority of our curriculum revisions occur over the summer, and teachers take the lead in making these changes. At the K-5 level, we use these learning standards to generate 1 through 4 scores. Here you can see the designation of each score, with the highest being a 4 or exceeding standards. 3 is meeting standards, 2 is approaching standards, and 1 is not yet meeting standards. This 1 to 4 scale is based on end of year benchmarks. So it's what happens at the end of the year, where should a student be? So if a student's score in November might be considered approaching standards because that student is still developing an understanding of a specific concept, and they have 7 or 8 months left in the school year to demonstrate the necessary proficiency. At the 6-12 level, we currently follow a traditional approach involving percentage grades. However, we're involving conversations with our middle school and high school in exploring potential options of making future changes.
Throughout the course of the year, we use a couple different assessment platforms. Assessment platforms are third-party products that deliver assessments to students. They measure both achievement and progress. In K-5, we use iReady, and in the middle school, we use the NWEA. Those are used as diagnostic assessments for all students. So these assessments measure skills in the areas of reading and math. They are adaptive assessments. As students answer more questions correctly, the questions get harder. As students may answer some questions incorrectly, the questions get easier. And it's the goal of the platform to figure out where that spot is where students are doing their most consistent achievement. Both of these platforms provide teachers with a lot of information on both individual student progress as well as trends that we might see across a grade level. With this data, we can make decisions about individual student academic support, as well as identifying needs in the curriculum that we can address across a grade level with our instruction or with changes to our curriculum maps. The third platform that you see on this list is eDoctrina. This is also an assessment platform, but different than the diagnostic assessment, eDoctrina is a place for us to deliver our local assessments, those that are created by Spencerport teachers or are in conjunction with a program that we use, such as Math Expressions at the K-5 level. This program allows us to use not only third-party vendor or state assessment data, but also good information around the local assessments that are aligned specifically to our curriculum. As many of you are familiar, New York State does have required assessments that each school district administers. Assessments are administered each year in grades 3 through 8 in both ELA and math. Grade 4 is a science test, as well as grade 8. And then in the high school, there are New York State required Regents exams. Algebra, global history, US history, and one of the science exams, either earth science or living environment, and English language arts are required for graduation. There are additional Regents exams that students can take based on the courses in which they enroll. Those include geometry, algebra 2, chemistry, and physics.
So most people are familiar with the legislation involving No Child Left Behind. However, it's been replaced by a new act called Every Student Succeeds Act. This act is an accountability measure, and our state education department provides Spencerport and other districts across the state feedback on their students, specifically in terms of their academic achievement based on specific assessments, their growth from year to year, English language proficiency for our students where English isn't their native language, and cohort graduation rates. So what a cohort means is once a student enters ninth grade, they're now on a 4-year track for graduation. They're now with their ninth grade cohort. So we often coin it as class of 2022, when in fact we really start back when that class started in ninth grade at our high school. So we're measured on 4 years, 5 years, and 6-year graduation rates. If we move on to the next section, you'll see that some examples of the subgroups include our English language learners, students with disabilities, those that are economically disadvantaged, and New York State also classifies subgroups by race, for example, Black, Hispanic, white, etc. Each group is measured on a 1 to 4 scale based on their level of achievement, growth, and even attendance. If a subgroup is identified as a level 1 for 2 consecutive years, then the school designation is designated as a Target Support and Improvement School, or a TSI school. The next slide gives us a little bit more information of what that really means. So participation or lack of participation in grades 3 through 8, ELA, math, and science can affect the school's composite achievement level and progress level, which could in turn affect a school or district's accountability status. So for example, right now, in one of our buildings, we're designated as a TSI school because we do not have enough students taking assessments. And then those that are taking the assessment, they're not achieving at a certain level because every student within a subgroup that doesn't participate in an assessment penalizes the entire building. So when more than 5% of continuously enrolled students in an accountability group do not participate in state assessments, the subgroup's weighted average achievement index decreases. This then impacts our overall status. So in Spencerport, because of our high opt-out rates, we are required to complete and submit to SED a participation rate improvement plan. Then based on our designation in one of our schools, they have been designated as a targeted support and improvement school. And with that requires us to complete and submit a comprehensive improvement plan of how we're going to rectify the issue. Now I know that ESSA has a lot of information, and I know that I just threw out a lot of jargon, and I apologize. It's a complicated system in terms of accountability, but as it stands right now, Spencerport has a TSI designated school. I think everyone knows too that we put pause on both our Regents exams and our 3-8 assessments the last few years, even as early as last month with our January Regents exams, those were canceled. We do not have information at this time of what it will look like for our 3-8 assessments in the spring or the Regents exams in June. However, we are acting as if we'll need to administer those assessments and that students will need to participate. Our last item here is really an opportunity for you, our audience, to pose questions in our chat. There's a chat feature at the bottom of the screen where it says Q&A. If you would like to pose a question, feel free to do so. Chris and myself will do our best to answer those questions. And then also, if you have a question that you would like to pose at a later time, like I mentioned earlier, Chris and I are always available for you to call us to have a conversation that might be pertinent to your specific child or question that you may have that impacts you or your family.
So I'm keeping an eye over here on the Q&A section of our webinar. And right now there are no questions, but we'll give you just a moment to enter in any questions that you may have. And as those questions populate, we'll be sure to share the questions as well as the answers with you. So first question, Mr. Zinkowicz, is how has COVID impacted year-over-year assessments?
So I think when COVID first hit, March in 2020, we put pause on all state assessments. And for that school year, the 3-8 assessments were not factored in, were not administered. Same with the Regents exams as well. For the 2021 school year, last year, people may recall that our 3-8 assessments, usually for ELA and math, are over 2 days. The state reduced those assessments down to 1 day. And Regents exams, instead of us offering 10 different Regents exams, we only offered 4. They were for US history, math, and science, and the 2 sciences as well, earth science and living environment.
As far as some of our other measures that we've had more control over, I go back to those assessment platforms, NWEA and iReady at the K-5 level. We've continued to administer those diagnostic assessments, which is allowing us to compare growth for a cohort as they've moved from one grade level to the next, as well as allowed us to look at what does our typical second grade achievement look like, where are we right now. We've been using that information to help us modify curriculum and to fill any skill gaps or areas in certain standards that are needed in the following grade level. So we've continued to administer assessments like those for diagnostic purposes year over year. We've also continued to administer our local assessments as well, which gives us the same opportunity to look at typical year performance as well as a cohort from one year to the next.
So the next question is really about opt-out option and the cause for the district to be affected to be a TSI school. So Spencerport was identified as a TSI school. So one building within our district was designated as TSI. That was at the conclusion of the 2018-2019 school year. That was based on opt-out rates and achievement rates for the students that participated and those that did not from the previous 2 years. So our first year of being a TSI designated school was the 1920 school year. Now, as I previously shared, the state eliminated those assessments, and so those did not factor in. Last year, the 2021 school year, those assessments were reduced from 2 days to 1 day. So because of the past 2 years, we're unable to get off this list simply because our students haven't not had the opportunity to participate in the assessments and to demonstrate the necessary proficiency. Once again, for grades 3 through 8, both reading, so ELA, and math, the expectation is that 95% of our students participate in those state assessments. We range anywhere from 50% participation to 80% participation. So we have work to do in terms of students sitting for those assessments. We're confident based on past years' history, when students take those assessments, they're successful on those assessments. And with that success will allow us to now be removed from that TSI designation. So the next question really involves homework. And the question, it seems like there's less homework assigned this year. When can we expect a return to normal? Well, it's a very timely question because Mrs. Polini and myself are currently facilitating a homework ad hoc committee at both the K-5 and the 6-12 levels, where we're working with stakeholders, so students, teachers, administrators, and parents, on coming up with a recommendation for our superintendents of school of what we want to do with homework. So it's a very good question.
One of the next questions is, other than iReady, what assessments or diagnostics do we use to determine if a child qualifies for RTI? We use a variety of different assessments. So our typical common assessments that we use at K-5 for ELA include iReady, plus student on-demand writing pieces, plus student Spontus and Pinnell levels as well. So those 3 different assessments are factored into ELA to start the conversation. And then we also use feedback from classroom teachers and any interventionists who have worked with the child, to determine RTI services. In math, we also use iReady data as well as math expressions unit assessments, quick quizzes, and teacher input as well. At the 6 through 8 level, we're using that NWEA assessment as well as unit assessments and teacher feedback to determine qualification for RTI services. There was another question back to how we were using assessments year over year, a question about how the assessment data is looking at iReady and NWEA year over year. It varies a little bit. So we actually do see in ELA, most of our grade levels are still performing at the same achievement level they were in 2019, so pre-pandemic. We do see some dips in math, and we're working using our local assessments to determine specifically what standards may have been largely not mastered at a particular grade level. And team leaders and teachers at the K-5 level are working to modify their upcoming units. So for instance, if we know in 3rd grade, this standard wasn't really mastered by students on a whole, then when we know that concept comes up in 4th grade, we're building in time to make sure that we can reinforce that skill prior to needing to use it in the following grade level. So we're finding those local assessments really helpful in identifying those areas. We are also seeing some great growth during the 21-22 school year. I think a lot of that is a return to 5 days of instruction this year.
So the next question just involves the type of feedback that parents receive about their child's progress and also their parents' involvement in the assessment process. So really, as you know, at the 6-12 level, we send out report cards 4 times a year. And at that K-5 level, we send out report cards 3 times a year. So each one, though, is really to provide parents an update, a status report, if you will, on how their child is doing up to that point. Also, when you think of the K-5 level, how they're measuring now based on that end of year benchmark. So if with the report card at the 6-12 level, if a student is struggling or they're not meeting the necessary standard or progress, the expectation that we have is that parents should be receiving communication from the school in a timely manner and that there should not be any surprises. We recognize the importance of being partners with our families, and so we need to be on the same page. So if a report card arrives home and a parent is surprised by a grade that a child has received, that's an opportunity for that parent to reach out to that teacher and just to have a conversation, because it should be just the opposite. Especially if a student, let's say, has an A the very first quarter, and then the second quarter, they fall down to a D, that parent should be receiving a phone call from the teacher or being contacted in some capacity, just sharing, the child's dip in academic performance, so they can figure out a solution how to work with the student and support them. We have another question as well, just in terms of about funding with TSI. We do receive additional funds from the state. I would share with you, though, my preference would be to be off that designation as opposed to receive these additional funds, because I don't know if the funds necessarily support all the things that we want to do with our students and with our schools. But yes, we do receive a little bit of funds from the state.
So there's a question about the elementary report cards. I'm hoping I can answer this correctly. And certainly if I don't fully answer your question, please feel free to put a follow-up question in the chat. So with the report card, we look at, let's say we'll take 3rd grade, for example, because it's right in the middle. So we have 3rd grade New York State standards for ELA, math, science, and social studies. And what we're measuring throughout the school year is the same thing all year. and it's the student's ability to meet that end of year target. So it is typical to see a 2 on that November report card because the student isn't already done with that particular standard and has already mastered it by November. Some may, and if your child receives a 3 on the report card, that's indicating they've already met that end of year grade level standard. I mentioned the question, I just want to make sure I answer all the parts of it. The final report card, it always could be a 2, a 3, or a 4. What you're looking for is obviously for students to be at a 3 on that June report card, because that would tell you the student has met the grade level standard. What this approach allows you to see is the growth over time. So for instance, we want to focus for students on moving from a 2 to a 3, with the conversation of you were working on this standard earlier in the year, but now you've met it. So you're really looking at that opportunity for growth, where in our former model, you might have a 3, a 3, and a 3. And it's hard to see what that growth might be because at each moment, in each trimester, the child was getting measured against a different benchmark along the way to that target. So we hope that this is a clearer communication around the progression. And then at all times, I'll echo Ty's comments, at all times, if you're not certain how the child is really progressing, or if you're not certain if your child is where he or she needs to be, please reach out to the teacher and to have that conversation. I know our teachers would be happy to engage in that conversation with you.
So the next question involves if Spencerport's considering only using assessments when assigning grades for our students. I think we're trying to provide a personalized approach for our students. So for what does that mean? So if Kristen and myself both have the same teacher, what works for Kristen may not necessarily work for me. Kristen may learn one way, I may learn a different way. Kristen may benefit by demonstrating what she knows, what she understands, and what she's able to do a certain way. So for example, it could be a traditional assessment, whether it's a test or a quiz, because Kristen performs really well with that. However, myself, I may do better by providing an oral explanation to the teacher or provide a report on what I've learned to demonstrate that growth and that connection to the concept at hand. So we're working on this. We have an equitable grading group that we're working with just to kind of really gain some insight. But we want to make sure that we provide a personalized approach for our students because we recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all model.
So the next question is in regards to students' unfinished learning and how we'll bridge the gap to help them be prepared for the next grade. I think it's important to understand the role that assessment plays in being able to do just that. So some of our students are still doing very well and are still meeting grade level standards and didn't skip a beat. And some of our students are not in that same trajectory. So our students really are in very different places based on their own performance, achievement, and learning over the last year and a half. So the assessment information that teachers receive through both those summative assessments and a lot through their formative assessments, that's allowing teachers to adapt instruction, to know where the gaps are, and to design differentiated opportunities for students. So we're looking at it both on a holistic level as far as across a cohort. So what curriculum changes do we need? Math is the easiest way to explain it. So we know that those concepts are sequential and build on one another year to year. So as we look at math information and data from our assessments, we already know where there might be potential gaps in the following school year, and we can adjust curriculum in order to meet those. And then we're also looking at data for individual students or groups of students who might need some additional support or might need work given to them in a different way. And so we're able to use assessment data to try to address both of those to prepare students for the next grade, both as a whole in the Tier 1 curriculum and then also individually as needed.
So the next question just addresses the connection and the trust that we have with our teachers here in Spencerport, especially when it comes to evaluating students' academic progress in comparison to the state. I would argue that we put more credence on the feedback that our teachers provide. Part of the impetus of why Chris and I wanted to provide this information, when we look at all the different forms of assessment that we conduct on any given day, Chris and I are in classrooms on every single day, and teachers are assessing their students continuously. And our teachers know their children in their classrooms better than anyone. And so we do trust them. And so we use the feedback that they provide in helping us make these informed decisions when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to instruction, and when it comes to local assessments. I think when it comes to the state assessments, we use that as just one indicator. That's a one-time assessment that we use to make sure that it's a benchmark assessment, to make sure that we're on track, but we don't use it, that any feedback that we receive from the state, to think differently of our students or to penalize them in any way, shape, or form. In terms of RTI, for our RTI students, we're evaluating them continuously. So you heard me mention terms such as diagnostic assessment. So that's something that we do 3 times a year. You also heard me mention progress monitoring. So if we have a tier 2 or tier 3 student, we also progress monitor them really quickly. It doesn't take a lot of time, just to see if the intervention that we put in place is in fact working, or if we need to modify it in any way to further provide them additional support. We have a great system of teachers and teaching assistants in our schools, and we want to ensure that we equip them with the time and the resources to support any learning challenges that a child might have.
The next question is in regards to the first K-5 report card and a new approach and what sort of support we're providing to teachers. Over the summer, our team leaders and our K-5 instructional specialists created guidance documents for teachers for both ELA and math to support them in their use of the new report card. Additionally, our K-5 instructional specialists are attending each building's team leader meetings this month in order to retrain, if you will, on trimester 2, because each of the trimesters is a little different as far as the guidance document is concerned, and then offering assistance to classroom teachers and teams of teachers as well to work on using that guidance document to inform the report card.
So we have a question too about homework in classroom, if that will still be included in the grades or if it'll only be tests and assessments. Once again, I would say that we're still in discussion about this. We want to provide a personalized approach for our students. I think when you look at homework, how do we interpret homework? How do we administer homework? Is it consistent from classroom to classroom, grade level to grade level, teacher to teacher across our district? So we have a lot of conversations that we need to have. But we also recognize too that our students aren't widgets, and that we have to understand that they're still growing. They're going through this change from elementary to middle to high. And we also just don't want to assess them all the time just to come up with a score. So it's a complicated piece, and we're still having these conversations. And I'll also share too that we had another question about class rank and honor roll system. We have eliminated the class rank at the commencement level at our high school. We have phased out valedictorian and salutatorian. We have different levels of achievement, similar to university model. That was something that was proposed and presented and changed about 5 years ago. We had representatives from post-secondary institutions to help us with this. And we're pleased with this work and feel that it has the opportunity to recognize more students. I think with end of year benchmarks, we recognize that this initial year was going to have an implementation dip. We want to make sure that we engage in those conversations with families when we think about the standard for the end of that school year, whatever grade level it might be, kindergarten through 5th grade. It should not be a deterrent. It's not meant to be a deterrent. It's us just applying that standards-based grading.
And I also think one thing that I would call attention to on the K-5 report cards is the amount of time, care, and attention that teachers give to the narrative portions of the report cards. And you may have noticed that there's actually more space and opportunity for teachers to give that narrative feedback that they do in the individual write-ups for students. So I think that's another great tool for teachers to communicate with families on how the children are doing in the classroom.
And our last question here before we sign off comes with differentiation. I think that you've heard us mention, we recognize of our 3,600 students here in Spencerport, each one's different. Each one has a different set of skill sets. Each one has a different learning path that they're on. and we need to ensure that they feel like they're special. They feel that they're receiving the necessary attention that meets their unique needs. That's our responsibility as educators, and it's something that we're committed to. So with that, once again, I want to just share with everyone that this presentation will be posted on our website in the coming days. I want to thank everyone for your attention, your ability, your willingness to join Kristen and myself this evening. And keep in mind that we are partners with you. If you have a separate question that you would like to ask, please feel free to reach out to Kristen or myself. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Good night.